Today is September 29, 2025, and this is the Archives of Iowa Broadcasting Oral History. I am Paul Yeager, along with producer Cliff Brockman and editor Randy Schumacher. Our guest today is Dennis Reese. You may have heard him on several radio stations in Iowa, most recently on Iowa Public Radio in a few capacities. And Dennis, we'll get to your career in a minute, but where did Dennis Reese grow up?
Cedar Falls, Iowa.
Always
a great place to grow up.
And Cedar Falls what was your thought and career at that point when you were growing up? Was radio always something you wanted to do?
Never thought of anything except radio. I was an only kid. There were no kids in the neighborhood. My best friend was my radio. And I thought this is a way cool opportunity. I would just die to be on a station. And I started listening in, fifth grade or something to all the great stations back in the 60s. And there were some great top 40 stations. Didn't listen to classical or anything. Top 40, they were fantastic stations. WLS in Chicago, KWWL, Waterloo, WABC in New York. Fell in love with it.
Was there, you mentioned the stations. That's the beauty of the time you grew up. You could hear those stations from far away. Were you one of those that late at night really lit up in your listening?
Yeah, late at night was the fun part. People have forgotten that AM at night travels hundreds of miles depending on the station. I mean, the big thrill was to pick up 770 WABC out of New York, and I was in Cedar Falls, Iowa, but if the atmospheric conditions were right, WABC came just charging in loud and clear with the greatest DJs ever in history. And WLS in Chicago, KAAY in Little Rock, and list goes on. But these are just great AM stations that, FM was barely existing during that time. So it was all AM.
And you mentioned big voices. Were there voices that, did you want to be a rock jock? Did you want to be a news person? What was, when you was young Dennis listening, envisioning playing the role?
I really wanted to be a news person because these news guys had these amazing voices. Jeffrey Hendricks, the WLS, and his voice was so low, it just about rattled your speaker. And I thought if I could get that sort of a voice and do a 5-minute newscast and have it cover 25 states, that would be the ultimate, for me. Sort of never happened that way. It all started at a 5,000 watt station in Fresno, California. Now that's a joke. That's, you remember who said that?
Well, I don't remember who said that, but I have heard it.
Yeah. Well, it was from the Mary Tyler Moore Show.
Yeah. Well, so you hear the radio, you see the radio depicted on television. How does Dennis go in high school? What was your first radio job?
My first radio job was at KXEL FM in Waterloo. This was in 1970 when nobody was listening to FM. So I had this brand new studio with this wonderful equipment. And the station manager, I was 18 years old and I had a fabulous record library there. And he didn't care what I played. And I was able to go on 100,000 watt FM and just play the records I wanted to. And it was great, great fun, to say the least, to do that. And so KXEL FM 105.7 was my first. 1970 in high school, that was a big deal. That was really exciting to do that. And especially be on the AM station once in a while, which was 50,000 watt clear channel covering 25 states at night.
Did you go on the air first as Dennis Reese, or did you have a DJ name?
I went on the air as Dennis Reese, and then I stole the name from WABC. I stole the name Jay Reynolds, which was really, I don't know why I did that. It was kind of cheating. But Jay Reynolds was the overnight guy on WABC, so I just started using his name at KWWL, top 40 station, 1330. And so that was my name.
Well, I know some people that will have different names for different radio stations. Like if they're in a group, that they're known as one voice on one station and another name on the other station. So how long did you stay at KXEL?
Oh, I was just there a year or so. And then remember looking out the big picture window on that studio on Highway 281 East in Waterloo and looking at the 5 towers from AM 1330 KWWL. And I told the staff, I said, I really want to work over there because everybody and their dog was listening to 1330 KWWL AM. And the interesting thing is, even to this date, the story that I always heard was it still set a national record of the highest CUM, or average quarter hour, in radio history. We were pulling a average quarter hour rating of around 82 to 83%, which means that everybody was listening to it in Northeast Iowa. I mean, 4 out of 5 people tuned into radio were tuned into AM 1330. So it was a huge thrill to be a top 40 jock on a station with that high of a rating.
Were you such a big deal that people recognized you when you went to the grocery store?
Yeah, it was my classmates at Cedar Falls High School, my classmates at the University of Northern Iowa. Anybody who figured out who I was a celebrity. And it was just unbelievable. It was just so amazing, and it was such a huge amount of fun. And I would sit down there at the evening shift on KWWL. I'd be down there at 10:30. Tom Peterson, who was the anchor on Channel 7 and a fabulous guy, recently died, who went on to WGN in Chicago. But he would finish his 10 o'clock Channel 7 newscast and come downstairs to the AM radio studio, and which was right next door to the TV newsroom, and sit in with me at night and hand me records, 45 records to play. He would choose the records and throw them at me. And he would sit there until midnight or 1 o'clock because he was such a radio guy. And we had more fun. I can't even begin to tell you how much fun that was.
Well, who were the bosses that hired you, and general manager and owner at that time?
Well, Bob Buckmaster from in the early days. Grant Price was the news director, but I didn't have too much to do with him because the TV guys who were right next to the AM studio really didn't like the jocks much because we were just jocks. But I would have to go in the TV newsroom to grab the weather off the wire, and then they would give me a dirty look like, "What are you doing touching our wire?" Well, I need the weather for the radio station, which probably has more listeners than your TV station has viewers. I mean, it's probably true. But I can't remember who the boss was at the time who hired me, but it doesn't matter.
Well, Bob Buckmaster is the name I was kind of wondering about, and I've heard the Grant Price stories about the beginnings of that station, and you growing up in that area. I'm sure it was, everybody knows the McElroy, Buckmaster, and all the other broadcast names. So, did you think that your whole career was going to be there in Waterloo, and what made you think that there were other things to go see and do?
No, I wanted to work for a bigger market. So after I finished my freshman year at UNI, I decided I would go to the University of Minnesota just so I could get a radio job. Is that just stupid or what? And I applied for a bunch. And as a University of Minnesota student, I just wanted a part-time job. I was turned down a number of times and finally was offered a job at KTCR 97.1 FM, which was classic country. Now, did I know anything about country music? I know nothing about it. But still, FM was kind of low man of the totem pole. So they had a brand new studio and a million beautiful new albums. And I got acquainted very quickly with, Johnny Cash and Lynn Anderson and Waylon Jennings and, Grandpa Jones, you name it. And it was really a heck of a lot of fun just to segue records and chatter on a Twin Cities radio station. So that was fun. So I've been a country jock. Not a lot of people know that. Was in public radio for so long.
Were you then known as Buck Reese, or did you?
I think I used my real name there.
Well, you never know what, some stations always make them, make the DJ sound like what the theme of that is. So you were in Minnesota for a while. Did you graduate from University of Minnesota?
Well, no, I came back to my senior year at UNI. I was sort of a lost soul at that point. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. So I finished at UNI and then became news director at KCFI in Cedar Falls. It all started at a 500 watt, as the joke goes. That was Ted Baxter who said that on the Mary Tyler Moore show. It all started at a 5,000 watt. KCFI was at that time just a daytime station and kind of lagging in the ratings. But, I was news director, so that was kind of fun. Hadn't done that before. So I had to learn about radio journalism pretty quickly. And Then I went from there to being a grad student at the University of Iowa in communication studies and studied with Sam Becker for 3 years, the great Sam Becker, as of the Sam Becker Communication Studies Buildings fame, and finished a master's degree from Iowa.
The news side of things, because early 1970s, from what I've heard, was quite the wild and crazy times in radio. What drew you more to news then when you went in your grad work at Iowa versus staying? I mean, I know you had been news director there in Cedar Falls, but what was the draw?
The draw for news?
Yeah.
Well, it was truth and beauty and justice the American way. You wanted to go out and report what actually happened and do a good job. But news is a lot more work than I really wanted to experience for the next 40 years. It really is it's a lot of work to be a reporter. And so I lucked out and went over to the programming side, which actually was not as much of a grind. And well, what happened was I got my master's, didn't know what to do, couldn't find a job, went back to Waterloo, Cedar Falls, got a job as news director at KXEL for a year. Really didn't like that very much for a number of reasons. And then I get this call from the University of Iowa Broadcasting Service, and it was Hugh Cordier, the director of broadcasting, and George Klingler, the assistant director. They knew me as a student, and they said, Dennis, we have this job coming up. Do you want to move back to Iowa City again to take a public radio job? And I said, you betcha. I mean, I was on my way to Iowa City again to grab that job, which was the best thing that ever happened to me because it was a fabulous 30-some years in public radio, which is just a great place to work. It really is.
What year is this?
81.
Okay, so tell me about public radio in 1981.
Well, okay, they hire me on May 1st, 1981. I start on a Friday. I walk in the door, and they're all standing around and saying, who are you? And I said, I'm Dennis Reese. You guys hired me. Oh, yeah, we forgot. We thought you were starting Monday. Well, it's kind of a joke. So I said, no, I'm here. You said to show up May 1st. So I started as a producer, as a news producer, and then transitioned over to being program director. And no, I've forgotten what your original question was.
Well, I was just like, what was the station like? How many? What was
well,
the staff?
Station was an odd public radio. The way it was divvied up at that time, you had Central Iowa being covered with a strong AM signal and a strong FM signal. In Eastern Iowa, KU and I had just signed on a couple of years before doing news and music, which covered Iowa City and Cedar Rapids. The University of Iowa stations were AM and FM. The FM was just classical needle drop. And the AM was just totally disintegrating when I started. It was just a mess. The staff had been there for decades. Nobody was doing anything. It was just, I couldn't believe it. The signal quality on the AM station, which was AM 910, was so bad you couldn't even listen to it. And so I went into George's office, George Klingler, and said, look, man, you hired me to run this AM station. And AM was failing. It was starting to go downhill pretty quickly at that time because FM, as you probably know, caught up with AM in 1975. By 81, FM was the hot commodity, which of course it still is. And I said, if you want me to do something with this AM station, you're going to have to give me some money to spend to make it sound good and to get a couple of more staffers. And he sat there, and he was very conservative financially, the way they ran the place, really low budget. And he said, well, okay, we're going to give you the money, and you just do something with this place. So I got the equipment I needed to improve the signal, which made it listenable and actually sounded pretty good. It's almost as good as FM. Got a couple of more staffers in, and I started to build up that AM station. And you got to keep in mind that in public radio, there's very few AM stations. There's maybe 10 or 12 out of 300 and some public radio stations. So it's sort of it was a really rare bird. When I went to conferences, the people on the FM side, which was the predominant side, would say, you are crazy, man, to try to run an AM station. You just forget about it. It's not going to work. Well, I will tell you this. By 1985, WSUI AM was the top-rated station in Johnson County. beating the likes of KUNI with a 100,000 watt FM signal and the commercial station. So I was able to turn that place around. That was like my big moment, to be able to turn that AM station into something that, and I was really proud that I was able to accomplish that with the help of some really good staffers.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. I mean, signal's one thing. It had to have had some staff, those staff that you added. How'd you do it?
Well, I sent them out to do reporting because nobody was reporting. The only thing we were doing in 81 was what I would call faculty roundtable. We had a senior producer, Bob Irwin, who would bring in a couple of faculty members, put a tape on the Ampex machine, turn it on, and they would just kind of talk to each other for an hour. I mean, sometimes it was okay, but a lot of the times it was just dull, really dull stuff. And I said, we got to do something else besides this. So I sent these younger, well, I was 29, so I wasn't old, but I sent these 24-year-old, journalists out in the field to report. And, they covered Board of Regents, they covered City Council, they covered Cedar Rapids news, Quad Cities even. So it became like a news station. And plus, George gave me the money to buy the NPR programs that I wanted to buy, which were kind of pricey. So eventually I got to have all the cream of the crop in from NPR and APR, American Public Media, and Public Radio International, and the BBC I got full access to. So we ran all of this great stuff, programs like Car Talk and What Do You Know, and all of the NPR news programs. And it worked. It seemed to work. And I was really happy that worked out.
What would you say were the best years of your time there in Iowa City?
Well, it was just fine until the university told us in 1997 that we had to get out of the building. We were in the engineering building, which is right by the Pentecrest on Capitol Street. And Mary Sue Coleman, the president, said, we're going to tear down your building, and you guys figure out where to go. Well, what are we supposed to do? Well, the university found us this building on 710 South Clinton, which was an old A&P grocery store, believe it or not. But the university gave us the money to remodel it and to move the equipment and to buy some new equipment. And so we moved into a kind of a weird building, but it worked out well until 2004. And then we were told that Iowa Public Radio was going to take us over. So I guess everything was perfect until 2004. And then it was a terrific process to meld into IPR. And there was a lot of people fired, and there was a lot of bad feelings and stress. And the other program directors were fired at Ames and Cedar Falls, and they were going to fire me. And then they finally said, well, we've got this one opening for midday news anchor, and if you want to take that, you can stay on with IPR. And of course, I wanted a job, and so I said, I'll do it. And so, I don't know, it worked out fine. But I mean, my halcyon days were probably the 80s and early 90s when WSUI was really a way cool AM station, and people really appreciated that station.
Who did you consider competition then on those high water days? KUNI, and we hated each other. I hate to say it, but Doug Verdier and Carl Jenkins, God bless them both. I finally became really close to them later on, but at first we were at each other's throats competing because KUNI has a 100,000 watt FM signal on the Channel 9 tower serving this massive geographical area. And so that was the competition, AM versus FM. And AM won most of the time down in the southern part of that market, Iowa City, Cedar Rapids. So that was the competition. We didn't really compete too much with commercial radio. Public radio is so different. It's so different. So, well, and that's what I was going to ask, especially on the news side of things. I get programming is different, but I didn't know if WMT, we're here, WMT's here. That's not how you thought. If KUNI was there, that's when you noticed.
Yeah. And it's so funny because eventually I decided, look, this is crazy to keep this pettiness going and, kind of bad mouthing each other, with KUNI. And so I just decided we would just try to get along. And so I called Greg, the late, great Greg Shanley, fabulous person, the news director at KUNI, and we decided just to maybe cooperate a bit. And then Doug Vernier, who started KUNI in the 1970s at the University of Northern Iowa, I called him and I called Carl Jenkins, program director, and said, let's just get along, maybe trade some stories. And so that worked out splendidly. And when Doug Vernier retired, after all the bitterness in the early years, he calls me and says, Dennis, I know you're a book collector, especially of broadcasting books. He said, I'm retiring. You come up here and take all the books you want from my office. So I went up there and loaded my car with Doug Vernier's books. So it ended on a very, I guess, satisfactory, happy note at the end, I'm pleased to say.
Let's go into the merger again of the three stations to make Iowa Public Radio. You mentioned feelings were hard. The driver of that was economics, right? The universities were not going to be... I guess, tell me from your vantage point, what was the driving force for that merger?
Well, it was economics. The regents decided that they could save money and not spend as much money on the three university stations if we would merge. I don't know whose idea that was originally, but it happened pretty quickly. And then we were forced into all of these meetings. They spent a fortune on consultants and sending us to meetings all over the state to try to get to know each other, which was fine. But it was really stressful. And a lot of people just decided to retire early or just not even deal with it because they were going to cancel some programs from each place. I mean, in Iowa City, they immediately canceled Live from Prairie Lights, which was my big accomplishment at WSUI, which had gotten national attention when we started that book reading from Prairie Lights Bookstore in downtown Iowa City in 1990. And the new IPR program director said, we don't want to do that. He just canceled it. You know, this is the writing university. This is the home of the writers workshop. And he just decides to cancel this program. And he canceled my late night jazz program. Believe it or not, I had on AM with a longtime jazz producer, and he was fired. It was just a bloodbath for a few years until finally Myrna Johnson came in and sort of settled. She's still there. She kind of settled everything down. Now I think it runs fairly smoothly. Although, you know, considering what's going on now with CPB dying and all that money being canceled from these stations, which is really a tragedy. But yeah, it was a very stressful time.
The Corporation for Public Broadcasting is what the CPB. You and I can speak public media words if you want, but I should define that for the audience. Dennis, when you talk about this theme of, I mean, was it pitched to you as a theme of statewide from the very beginning, or did that one of those consultant meetings lead to the statewide feel of this Iowa Public Radio?
No, I think they brought in a consultant, and I don't remember who the consultant was, but basically nobody had a choice, and the other stations were just as upset as we were. I mean, Doug Brown, probably the best public radio personality in Iowa history, in my mind, is nobody from Iowa City. I've got to hand that to Ames, because Doug Brown, the longtime voice of WOI, AM and FM, classical announcer, wrestling announcer for Iowa Public TV, a learned man, the host of the book club for many years, reading Charles Dickens stories, you know, and doing all the character and all the voices perfectly, a genius. And he would come to Iowa City once in a while and just say, look, Dennis, this is a disaster. This whole thing is a disaster. And it was really horrible for a while, and everybody was very upset. But as I said, eventually sort of straightened out, and thank goodness.
We're very familiar a lot of times with what goes on in commercial stations and mergers and acquisitions. I mean, this was the public media version of a merger and acquisition, I guess, kind of combining the three. Is radio better because there can be the voice of Iowa City and Cedar Falls and Des Moines and Ames? I shouldn't even say Ames, because really they're in Des Moines now. They're not even really in Ames anymore.
Well, I don't know. The way IPR is functioning now, it's functioning pretty well. And you've got some very good people there, and the people I worked with in Iowa City, like Charity Nebby, and Charity's still a good friend of mine, and some others are doing a great job. Ben Kiefer, they're doing a great job, and it's kind of cool to be on a statewide service. So in 2004, I went from talking on one radio station on one AM frequency to talking on 25 frequencies during my midday shift. And that was kind of a thrill in a way, because now at that point I was finally heard in Des Moines, Sioux City, Fort Dodge, Mason City, down into almost all the way to Kansas City on that station, and Osceola, and the repeaters in the Quad Cities, Dubuque, so forth. So that was kind of cool in a way. So I think it's worked out okay, and I think IPR is a very good service. There's no question. Michael Leland, the news director now, is very, very good, and the staff is excellent. I'm retired, so I can sit and listen to it.
And there, towards the end of your career, Dennis, some of the people that came through have now moved on to other affiliates of public radio, national voices. I can think of a few. No need to name them all, but did you feel that is that a sign of your station is important because it would send people on to the next level, or did you feel like, no, we need them to stick around to continue to make this a great station?
Oh, most of the staffers that I hired, the students I hired, were obviously young, and their idea was to get into major markets, and so I don't blame them. As I said early on, I wanted to be in the Minneapolis market. That was all I was thinking about. So many my students have moved on to Boston and Nashville, Las Vegas, and so forth. Dave Becker being the perfect example of a brilliant student who went on to be program director at KNPR in Las Vegas, and he just retired. So they went on to do some great things on other stations, all for these staffers, and good for them.
What is the current state as we sit here in 2025, the late part of the year? We know that public media is changing dramatically. Do you think that the merger specifically for radio in Iowa is going to allow them to have at least a better chance of surviving than maybe if it would have been an individual station?
Yeah, no, there's no question, because we gained some economic advantages from being merged. I mean, we just have one news director, one program director. It saved a lot of money that way, and then so it all worked out well. I just am worried that they just lost $1 million. I mean, out of this crazy amount of money just to lose with very little notice. So I really worry about that. And I worry about the fact that a station like the station at Penn State, KPSU, is just totally shutting down. The university is totally shutting down Penn State Public Radio and Penn State Public TV for Central Pennsylvania. It's just going to disappear. And I hope that does not happen here. Really hope that doesn't happen here.
What's that say about the state of public media?
Well, I don't know. I don't know what it says. I think public media is still very important. I know people listen to podcasts, and public media does podcasts. I mean, God knows we didn't do podcasts when I was there. And now there's and you're listening to public radio, but you're just not listening to a frequency. So it's really about the same difference. And I don't have a problem with that. But anyway, I don't know what's going to happen.
What in your eyes, Dennis, made a good radio program? Well,
the faculty roundtable were not good, because you need a journalist. The thing about a journalist is a journalist can intercede and explain things to the listener. And a good journalist does that. The good journalist calls resources and people that know what's going on and where they can explain to the average person. And after we started doing that, finally, I think we were able to accomplish a lot, and real people were tuning in and understanding complex issues. And the issues are complex, God knows. We also, you should mention, I mean, just the personalities that we interviewed over the years. It's just stunning amount of interesting people that people forget, for example, that at WSUI, and KSUI FM. We started a jazz show with David Scorton, the University of Iowa president, and Frank Conroy, the director of the Writers' Workshop at the time. I let them into the building, and they played jazz on Saturday night. The talk shows, interview. We had many, many interesting guests over the years. You're supposed to ask me my favorite guest out of all the years.
And your favorite guest over all the years is?
I thought about it. I was sitting, it's probably 1994, and I was sitting in my studio at 710 South Clinton, and somebody walks in the door just unannounced, and this driver said, Dennis, I have Kitty Carlisle here for you. Do you remember Kitty Carlisle?
I don't. I've heard the name.
She was the longtime guest on What's My Line, the panel show for many, many years. She was a singer, an opera singer. In 1935, she was in the Marx Brothers movie At the Opera with the Marx Brothers. And she was 90, and she was married to Moss Hart, famous, producer. And she just walks in the door. She's 95 years old. I said, bring her in. I want to talk to her. So I got to talk to Kitty Carlisle at age 95 about what it was like to work with the Marx Brothers. And she went in depth to tell me what they were like off the set. A great fun. And my first interview, believe it or not, this was 1981, late in 81. Also walking in the door in the old newsroom in the engineering building was W.P. Kinsella, author of Shoeless Joe, later, the Field of Dreams movie from the novel Shoeless Joe. He was teaching at Iowa in 1981 and 82. And I said, come on in, I'll talk to you. Nobody knew who he was. And I said, what are you working on, Bill? He went by Bill. And he said, Dennis, I'm working on a novel called Shoeless Joe about this magical baseball team in Iowa. I said, well, that sounds kind of cool. And of course, the book came out in a few months and has been, just an amazing bestseller. And I have a first edition of that book with his signature, and as I treasure it.
And that's the part of the public radio station based at a university that you have access to. It's if your ears are out and your eyes are open, you are going to get those guests. And I think that's what your audience has always appreciated. When you mention and talk about podcast, Dennis, I mean, let's face it, the podcast industry is just stealing from public radio over the years. All of the small niches that everybody has and exploits for big or for small, I guess you have to kind of take that as a compliment.
Yeah, no, I agree. Totally agree.
Do you get the sense that public radio's future, financial aside, is going to still have to be in that lane of interesting people, good storytelling, the journalist or the good host that can kind of keep an audience with all the distractions around them?
Yeah, and they're still doing that. I mean, ask my wife, who listens to Fresh Air each day. Terry Gross is talking about retiring, but I don't think she ever is. Programs like that are just unique and can't be there. You just don't find people like Terry Gross anywhere. And so public radio keeps doing that, and some of their newer shows are just outstanding. And you get in, it's called the driveway moment. We used to joke about that, you pull in your driveway and you're still listening, so you just sit in your car until the interview is finished. But that still happens all the time, and that's going to save public broadcasting, I think.
I've had those driveway moments. I've heard you talk about them in pledge drives before. That's a very good hook, and it's a very true statement. When you don't want to hear, you don't want to miss the end. You're like, oh, I'll find it online. You never do. You got to stay and hear that moment, and that's how I've long felt. Dennis, let's finish up here if we could. I know we're not going to be able to fix everything in the media, but how are we going to fix the first couple of lines here of your biography? How do you want to be remembered?
Well, I would say I want to be remembered by salvaging a dying AM station. That's kind of a weird thing to say, but I did bring public radio to Eastern Iowa that they didn't have it before. And they had, we had some competition, but the programs and the personalities we had on the air for decades out of Iowa City on an AM station were truly stunning. And any place you went in town, people would say, I just heard this on WSUI. Well, WSUI was the first radio station west of the Mississippi, started on January 1st, 1919 by Carl Menzer. And so WSUI had a history going back decades, and then it sort of went into the doldrums in the late 1950s, into the 60s, and early into the 70s, really. So to bring it back as a full-fledged 5,000 watt radio station, I mean, I think I'm glad I was able to do it, and I think it contributed a lot to Eastern Iowa media and to making Johnson County the very amazing place that it is. I mean, it really is an amazing place. Johnson County, Iowa. You want to live here because it has these great resources, and to bring good radio to it was, I think, an accomplishment. So pat myself on the back, and to start programs like Live from Prairie Lights, where we're bringing writers in from around the world, and we did that program. It was live. It was 7:00 in the evening. Julie Englander was the host. She was excellent, and we had all these writers on the air, and it sounds like an easy thing to do, but it wasn't. You had all these logistics. The store did most of the work, Jan Weissmiller at Prairie Lights. But we had to worry about things like people swearing on the air, like authors, and they would have maybe a couple of drinks before they went on. And we would have to tell them, look, we could lose our FCC license if we did. And it was little things like that, but we pulled it off, and we had literally hundreds of authors on the air until it was canceled by IPR.
And I get the shows that you had are more programs than they are news programs. Some stations would masquerade that as a news program, but those are two different genres, aren't they?
Yeah. I mean, we're not news radio. I mean, it's not WINS 1010 New York radio. It's, we have newscasts, and we want those newscasts to be good, and we have news reports and features. But a lot of what we do is I can't tell you how many lectures I recorded over the years. We called it rostrum, which is really an old-fashioned concept of recording somebody in Iowa City speaking on something, a political scientist from another university or a politician, and we would broadcast the entire speech, tape delayed. No, that's not news. It's programming. But it's in depth, and of course, one of my accomplishments I'm really proud of. The management was still fairly conservative, believe it or not, for the years I was in Iowa City, and I had to talk them into letting me broadcast Car Talk because they thought it was just not academic and just too frivolous. But it was probably my favorite public radio program of all time, other than Fresh Air. And so we got to run Car Talk. People loved it. We got to run Michael Feldman and some of the comedy programs. So there's some comedy and some fun stuff to listen to also.
Well, let's face it, Click and Clack, I mean, they are very controversial. You can't mess with that brother or the other brother. But I'm so glad that they live on in the Cars movie, and so people can hear them and understand that those two characters were very similar to what they were on the radio show, is now in cinema from that Cars movie from the early 2000s. That's my kids' generation there, Dennis. Sorry if that doesn't ring there with you. But you mentioned Terry Gross and Fresh Air and the programming. One last thing here is the time of your career is the soundbite got smaller. I always think of news. The programming and the in-depth interviews, not everybody likes to sit for those anymore. And is that a good thing or a bad thing that they don't like to sit for those anymore, the people that are interesting?
Well, I don't know. You're right. I think we were long format back then, and people back then would agree to sit for 30 minutes or an hour. I mean, the talk show was an hour, and we would have guests on for the full hour. Yeah, it is probably more difficult today when things are in sound bites, but I don't know. You can't beat long form, in-depth programming. And I should mention one more anecdote. Maybe the most stressful thing that happened when we were in the engineering building. was the 1991 Ganglu murders on November 1st, 91. I've told people may not have heard this story, but I was setting up for a Live from Prairie Lights at Shambaugh Auditorium at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then all of a sudden I was there at about 3 o'clock, and then I heard all these sirens running in the background. And it was a horrible day. The October 31st, it was nice. November 1st, 91, started to snow and sleet, and the temperature dropped to like 40 degrees. It was a nasty day. And then this happened. But I went back to the studio in the engineering building, and literally John Deeth helped me, one of my student assistants. The phones were ringing from, I would say, 4:30 through 8 or 9 o'clock, with stations calling WSUI to get an update, thinking that we knew more than they did, and we didn't know a little bit more. I literally picked up the phone every couple of minutes. I would hang up with WCBS News Radio in New York. I'd hit line 2, and it was the BBC in London calling. John and I would summarize what we knew, hang up, hit the button. It was, KSO and a station in Los Angeles, News Radio, in all over the world. We were getting calls from all over the world. It was such an amazing story, and I'm pleased to say we did a pretty decent job reporting on it. But what a day! That was a day that will live in infamy, as far as I'm concerned. Just a horrible tragedy.
Yeah, I still think of that when you walk by Jessup Hall, or you see, some of those locations where that happened, and that's to have a seat there and to make sure that story is told. Is very important for the state. So thank you for your work that day, Dennis.
One more news event: the flood of 2008. I actually went out with my tape recorder. That was when IPR had started. Walking down Madison Street by the IMU, I run into Dean Maxim, the Dean of Liberal Arts, and she's walking along looking morose and depressed, looking at all this flood water. I'm interviewing the dean, who's basically saying, "This is horrible. I am just stressed out. I don't know what I'm going to do." She was just distraught. I'm interviewing her as the flood water start to move in. It was a horrible time to see all these campus buildings flooded.
It was quite, again, another chapter of, to see Hanshaw Auditorium change like it did, and all those other places. They moved part of the art department way out of town it certainly left a strong fingerprint on the town.
Yeah.
Oh. Dennis, thank you so very much for your time and your work over the years. It was great to hear some of your stories.
Well, this was great fun, and hope I didn't blab on too long. But it was a long career.
It was a long career and a very good one, and very glad that we have that on tape. Dennis Reese, retired from Iowa Public Radio, WSUI, and the big guy from KXEL back in the day, but he was the big guy in high school in Cedar Falls, Iowa, along with our editor, Randy Schumacher, and our producer, Cliff Brockman. I'm Paul Yeager. Thank you for watching this Archives of Iowa Broadcasting Oral History.